Welcome back to the channel XRP on Moon, the place where we break down the biggest XRP narratives, hidden signals, and the kind of information that could genuinely change how you look at your financial future. Today's topic is one that's been quietly circulating among serious XRP holders, and it's powerful enough to challenge everything you thought you knew about wealth and crypto. The question is simple, but the implications are massive. Is 2000 XRP all you need? Stay with me, because what we're about to uncover might completely shift your perspective. Right now, most people in the crypto space are still thinking in old terms. They're chasing millions of tokens, billions in supply coins, and trying to hit that lottery-style outcome. But XRP has always been different. It was never designed to be just another speculative asset. It was built for utility, for global liquidity, for bridging value between institutions. And when you start to understand that, the idea of needing millions of tokens starts to fade. Instead, a much more strategic question emerges. How much XRP would actually be enough if its full utility is realized? Let's break this down logically. XRP's total supply is fixed at 100 billion tokens, but a significant portion is locked, held, or effectively out of circulation. On top of that, we have increasing institutional interest, ongoing legal clarity developments, and the expansion of Ripple's partnerships globally. Now imagine a scenario where XRP becomes a standard bridge asset for cross-border payments, replacing slow and expensive systems that banks currently rely on. In that kind of environment, demand doesn't just increase, it explodes. And this is where the 2000 XRP narrative begins to make sense. It's not about the number itself being magical, it's about positioning. If XRP were to reach valuations that reflect global liquidity usage, even conservative estimates start putting it in a completely different price range than what we see today. We're not talking about small percentage gains. We're talking about exponential shifts driven by real-world adoption. Now think about it from a psychological standpoint. Most retail investors underestimate how markets move during paradigm shifts. They assume gradual growth, slow adoption, predictable patterns. But history shows us that when a technology flips from optional to essential, price discovery becomes aggressive and unpredictable. Early internet companies, for example, didn't just grow, they surged beyond expectations because the market suddenly realized their importance. The same principle could apply here. If XRP transitions from being just another crypto to a backbone of financial infrastructure, the value per token becomes a reflection of global transaction demand, not retail speculation. And if that happens, holding even a few thousand XRP could place someone in a completely different financial category. But here's the part most people miss. It's not just about holding XRP, it's about holding it before the majority understands its role. Because once the narrative shifts publicly, the opportunity window starts to close. That's when institutions move aggressively, liquidity tightens, and retail investors are left chasing higher prices. Now, does that guarantee that 2000 XRP will make you financially free? Not necessarily. And anyone telling you it's guaranteed is oversimplifying a complex market. But what it does represent is a strategic benchmark. It's a level that many in the XRP community quietly consider a strong position if the long-term thesis plays out. And there's another layer to this: accessibility. Right now, accumulating 2000 XRP is still within reach for many people. It's not an impossible goal. But if prices begin to climb significantly, that same position becomes much harder to achieve. This creates a kind of time-based pressure where early positioning matters more than sheer volume. So what we're really looking at is a shift in mindset. Instead of asking, how much XRP do I need to get rich? The smarter question becomes, what position can I realistically build before the market fully recognizes XRP's potential? Because in a market driven by utility and institutional adoption, timing and positioning often matter more than sheer scale. As we move forward in this series, we're going to go deeper into the numbers, the scenarios, and the real-world implications of XRP reaching different price levels. We'll explore what 2000 XRP could actually look like under different adoption models, and whether this idea holds up under serious scrutiny. Because the truth is, this isn't just about numbers on a screen. It's about understanding a shift that could redefine how value moves globally, and whether you're positioned to benefit from it. Whether 2000 XRP could truly be enough, we need to shift from theory into structure, because this is where most people either gain clarity or completely lose the plot. Up to this point, we've talked about positioning and potential, but now it's time to examine what actually needs to happen in order for a relatively small holding like 2000 XRP to carry life-changing weight. The first thing you have to understand is that price in crypto, especially for an asset like XRP, is not driven by hype alone. Hype can move markets temporarily, but sustained high-level valuations only come from one thing: consistent, large-scale demand. And XRP's entire design is centered around solving a multi-trillion-dollar problem, specifically cross-border payments. Right now, the global financial system moves trillions of dollars every single day, but it does so inefficiently using outdated systems that are slow, expensive, and fragmented. XRP's value proposition is to act as a bridge asset that can settle these transactions in seconds with minimal cost. Now imagine, even for a moment, that XRP captures just a fraction of that daily volume. We're not talking about replacing the entire system overnight. Even a small percentage of global liquidity flowing through XRP would require a level of price stability and depth that is far beyond what we see today. This is where the concept of price compression versus price expansion becomes critical. When demand increases and supply is relatively fixed, the only direction price can move long-term is upward. And this is exactly why the 2000 XRP conversation exists. Because if XRP were to reach valuations that reflect even partial integration into global finance, each token would need to represent a much higher unit of value. Not because of speculation, but because of necessity. Liquidity at scale requires value density. In simple terms, fewer tokens need to carry more value to facilitate larger transactions efficiently. Let's break that down in a practical way. If XRP were operating as a bridge for large institutional transfers, think banks, governments, multinational corporations, then the system would favor higher prices per token to reduce the number of tokens required per transaction. This isn't just theory, it's basic liquidity mechanics. And when you apply that logic, you begin to see why some analysts believe XRP doesn't need to be owned in massive quantities to be impactful. But there's another side to this that often gets ignored: market psychology. Even if XRP achieves real-world adoption, the path to those higher valuations won't be smooth or predictable. There will be volatility, corrections, fear cycles, and periods where confidence is tested. And during those phases, the majority of retail investors make emotional decisions. They sell too early, they doubt their positions, or they get shaken out completely. So holding 2000 XRP isn't just about reaching a number. It's about maintaining conviction through uncertainty. Because if the thesis plays out over years rather than months, the real challenge becomes psychological endurance, not just accumulation. Now here's where things get even more interesting: scarcity perception. As adoption increases and more XRP gets locked into institutional use, long-term holdings, and utility-driven channels, the available supply on exchanges begins to shrink. This creates a subtle but powerful shift in market dynamics. Prices don't just rise because of demand, they rise because access becomes more limited. And when access becomes limited, even smaller holdings start to feel more significant. Suddenly, 2000 XRP isn't just a number, it's a position that fewer and fewer people can easily replicate. That's when the narrative flips. Early holders are no longer seen as lucky, they're seen as strategic. However, we need to stay grounded here. None of this is guaranteed. Markets are complex, regulations evolve, competition exists, and timelines can stretch far longer than expected. XRP has faced legal challenges, skepticism, and resistance. And while progress has been made, the journey is still ongoing. So the idea that 2000 XRP is all you need depends entirely on a chain of events that must unfold correctly. But what makes this conversation powerful is not certainty, it's possibility. It's the idea that a relatively achievable position today could become extremely difficult to obtain tomorrow. And in markets, that kind of asymmetry is where real opportunity lives. So as you think about your own position, don't just focus on the number, focus on the bigger picture. What role could XRP realistically play in the global system? How early are we in that transition? And most importantly, are you positioned in a way that aligns with that potential outcome? Now let's take this conversation to the level everyone has been waiting for, the actual numbers. Because up to this point, we've been talking about theory, utility, and positioning. But numbers are where belief either strengthens or completely falls apart. The question isn't just, can XRP grow? It's, what would that growth actually look like for someone holding 2000 XRP? Start with the most conservative scenario. Imagine XRP reaches levels that many consider realistic in a moderate adoption phase, somewhere between $5 and $10. At $5, a $2,000 XRP holding would be worth $10,000. At $10, that becomes $20,000. Now, for some people, that's a meaningful return. It could clear debt, fund a small business, or act as a stepping stone. But let's be honest, this isn't life-changing wealth for most. And this is where many people lose interest, because they expected instant transformation. But here's the critical mistake. They're looking at XRP through a short-term lens. Now shift slightly higher. Let's consider a stronger adoption scenario, where XRP begins to integrate more deeply into financial systems and gains broader institutional usage. In this case, price ranges between $50 and and $100 start entering the conversation, not overnight, but over time as utility builds. At $50, $2,000 XRP becomes $100,000. At $100, it becomes $200,000. Now we're entering a different category. This is where financial pressure starts to ease. This is where people begin to gain real flexibility in their lives. But we're still not at the level that fuels the 2000 XRP is all you need narrative. That idea comes from much more aggressive projections, scenarios where XRP becomes a core liquidity layer in global finance. If, and this is a big if, XRP were to reach $500 per token, then 2000 XRP equals $1 million. That's the point where the conversation shifts from helpful gains to life-altering outcomes. And if you push even further, $1,000 per XRP, that same holding becomes $2 million. Now, before you get carried away, it's important to ground this in reality. Prices like $500 or $1,000 don't happen in isolation. They require massive global integration, regulatory clarity across multiple regions, and sustained institutional reliance on XRP as a liquidity solution. These are not small milestones. They represent a fundamental transformation of the financial system. So while the upside exists, it's tied to equally significant developments. But here's where things get interesting again. Markets don't move in straight lines, and they rarely wait for full adoption before pricing in future potential. Speculation often anticipates reality. This means that even partial progress, major partnerships, regulatory wins, increased transaction volume, can push prices far beyond what current fundamentals might suggest. And during those phases, price movements can feel explosive. Now think about the psychological impact of that. If XRP begins to climb rapidly, say from single digits into double digits and then beyond, the narrative will shift quickly. Media attention increases, new investors flood in, and the fear of missing out becomes a dominant force. That's when late entrants start buying at higher prices, while early holders, those who accumulated quietly, find themselves in a position of strength. And this brings us back to the core idea. 2000 XRP doesn't guarantee anything, but it places you in a zone where multiple future scenarios, ranging from modest to extreme, can all produce meaningful outcomes. It's a position that offers asymmetric potential, where the downside is limited compared to the upside if the thesis plays out. However, there's one more layer that most people ignore: time. Because even if XRP reaches high valuations, the journey could take years. And during that time, patience becomes the ultimate asset. Many investors fail not because they chose the wrong asset, but because they couldn't hold it long enough to see the outcome. So when you hear someone ask, "Is 2000 XRP all you need?" the real answer isn't just about price. It's about time frame, conviction, and understanding the bigger picture. Because numbers alone don't create wealth. Positioning combined with patience does. Now, this is where the conversation shifts from possibility to discipline, because understanding what 2000 XRP could become is only half the equation. The real difference between those who benefit and those who miss out comes down to strategy. How you manage that position as the market evolves, as emotions rise, and as opportunities appear and disappear in real time. Most people think the hardest part is accumulating XRP. It's not. The hardest part is holding it correctly. Because when the market starts moving, especially in a strong upward trend, everything changes. Emotions take over, logic fades, and even the most confident investors begin to question their decisions. This is exactly where the majority lose their edge. Imagine this scenario. XRP starts climbing steadily. $1, $3, $5, then $10. At first, it feels exciting. Your 2000 XRP position is growing, and the numbers finally start to look meaningful. But then something interesting happens. Doubt creeps in. You start thinking, what if it drops back down? What if I lose these gains? And that's the moment many people make their first mistake. They sell too early. On the other side, there are those who refuse to sell at all. They become so emotionally attached to the idea of massive future prices, $500, $1,000, that they ignore every opportunity to secure real gains along the way. And when the market eventually corrects, as it always does, they watch those paper profits disappear. This is the second mistake: holding without a strategy. So what's the solution? Balance. A structured approach that removes emotion from the equation. Because if 2000 XRP is your position, then how you manage that position becomes more important than the number itself. One approach that experienced investors often use is tiered profit taking. Instead of selling everything at one price, they scale out gradually. For example, a small percentage might be sold at lower milestones to secure initial capital, another portion at mid-range levels to lock in profit, and the rest left untouched for long-term potential. This way, you're not relying on a single outcome. You're preparing for multiple scenarios. But strategy isn't just about selling. It's also about security. As XRP gains value, your holdings become a target, not just for market volatility, but for real-world risks like hacks, exchange failures, or simple mistakes. This is why long-term holders often move their assets into secure wallets, reducing exposure to external threats, because there's no point in holding 2,000 XRP if you don't actually control it safely. Now let's talk about another critical factor: noise. As XRP begins to gain attention, the amount of information surrounding it will explode. News, predictions, influencers, price targets, some accurate, many not. And during these periods, it becomes extremely difficult to separate signal from noise. People get pulled in different directions, constantly adjusting their strategy based on the latest headline. This is where clarity becomes your strongest advantage. You need to know why you're holding XRP. Is it for short-term gains, mid-term growth, long-term transformation? Because without that clarity, you'll end up reacting instead of acting. And in markets, reaction is usually expensive. And then there's patience, the most underestimated element of all. Because even if everything we've discussed plays out perfectly, it won't happen instantly. There will be delays, setbacks, and periods where nothing seems to happen at all. This is where many people give up. Not because they were wrong, but because they were early. Holding 2,000 XRP through those quiet phases requires a different kind of mindset. It requires confidence in your research, acceptance of uncertainty, and the ability to stay focused while others lose interest. Because often, the biggest moves come right after the longest periods of silence. So when you ask, is 2,000 XRP all you need? The deeper question becomes, can you manage that 2,000 XRP effectively over time? Because without strategy, even the best position can fail. But with the right approach, discipline, security, patience, and clarity, that same position can become incredibly powerful. It's time to bring everything together with absolute clarity. No hype, no exaggeration, just a grounded perspective on what 2,000 XRP really represents in the real world. Because after everything we've explored, utility, adoption, price scenarios, and strategy, the truth sits somewhere in the middle of optimism and realism. The idea that 2,000 XRP is all you need is powerful, but it can also be misunderstood. It's not a guarantee, it's not a shortcut, and it's definitely not a promise of instant wealth. What it really represents is a position of opportunity, a position that under the right conditions could become extremely valuable, but those conditions are not automatic. They depend on adoption, regulation, global financial shifts, and time. Let's be very clear here. XRP has strong fundamentals compared to many other digital assets. Its focus on real-world utility, particularly in cross-border payments, gives it a unique place in the market. The involvement of companies like Ripple and the ongoing development of the XRP ledger add credibility to its long-term thesis. But even with all of that, the path forward is not guaranteed. There are still challenges: regulatory uncertainties, competition from other blockchain technologies, and the unpredictable nature of global finance. This is why it's so important to separate belief from blind faith. Believing in XRP's potential is one thing. Assuming it will definitely reach extreme price levels is something else entirely. Smart investors operate in probabilities, not certainties. They position themselves for upside while staying aware of the risks. And speaking of risk, this is the part many people avoid, but it's the most important. The crypto market is volatile by nature. Prices can rise, but they can also fall just as quickly. Market sentiment can shift overnight. External events, economic changes, regulations, or even global crises can impact prices in ways no one can fully predict. So while 2,000 XRP could potentially become a very strong position, it could also fluctuate significantly along the way. Now here's the real takeaway. 2,000 XRP is not a magic number, but it can be a meaningful one. It's a level that balances accessibility with potential. It's enough to benefit from major upside if it happens, but not so large that it's completely out of reach for the average person today. And that's what makes this conversation so relevant. It's not about chasing unrealistic dreams. It's about understanding where opportunity might exist and positioning yourself accordingly. But beyond the numbers, there's a bigger message here. Wealth in markets is rarely created by luck alone. It comes from awareness, timing, discipline, and the ability to stay consistent while others hesitate. Whether it's XRP or any other asset, those principles remain the same. So if you're thinking about your own position, don't just ask, is 2,000 XRP enough? Ask yourself, what am I trying to achieve? What is my timeline? And am I prepared for the journey it takes to get there? Because those questions matter far more than any specific number. And finally, let's talk responsibility. Everything discussed in this video is for informational and educational purposes purposes only. This is not financial advice. The crypto market involves risk, and you should always do your own research before making any investment decisions. Never invest more than you can afford to lose, and consider speaking with a qualified financial advisor if needed. That being said, if you found value in this breakdown and want more deep insights into XRP and the future of digital finance, make sure you stay connected.